This podcast is on organizing reports, but beyond that, it's on the kinds of organizational patterns that we use for all kinds of writing. This is just as true in a freshman English class as it is a business writing class or an advanced composition class. All kinds of writing have to be organized, and when you're presenting information, you have to present it in some order. And often, especially for beginning writers, the order is whatever I happen to think of at the time. And that doesn't work in business writing or in most kinds of writing. You need to consciously decide how you're going to present the first thing, the second thing, the third thing, and the next thing in the report that you're submitting, or you're going to find that the most important things are buried too far into the report and that your communication doesn't have the effect that you need it to have on your audience. Your book presents 7 organizational patterns, and as I said, these are patterns for organizing all kinds of writing other than fictional writing, and even quite a bit of fiction is organized according to one or more of these patterns. These are just ways that you present information, ways that you decide what comes first and what follows. And there are a lot of different ways to do this. Some of them are better than others for some kind of reports. All I want to do here is very briefly go through these 7 different kinds of patterns and give you examples of how you might use each one in the kind of writing that you'll do in the business world. First, we have the comparison or the contrast. And officially, comparison means talking about what things have in common. Contrast talks about what things have that aren't in common. In practice, though, comparison and contrast is just the phrase that we use to talk about a report or a communication that compares the advantages and disadvantages of 2 different things. And these can be approaches to marketing, sales techniques, managerial techniques, job candidates, but it just assumes you have 2 or sometimes more of something. And the way that you organize the report is going to be as a comparison of the 2 or more things. This is very good for any report that requires a feasibility study or a recommendation because it allows you to come to a conclusion that embeds a recommendation. For example, let's say, and this is actually a decision that I made last year at Newman University. We have our admissions counselors, they go on the road, and we had to decide whether or not we were going to give them netbooks or iPad tablet computers. And we did a report on this. Netbooks are inexpensive, they have a very nice keyboard. iPads have a lot more functionality when it comes to media. iPads have a lot more, a lot stronger ability to connect to the internet. They're much better with music and with videos. Netbooks are a little bit better with text and with emailing. We decided to go with netbooks because of their enhanced keyboard capacities and because they were much cheaper. But that required us to do a report that detailed the comparisons between the netbook computers and the tablet computers, and from that we drew a recommendation about which would work best for the admissions counselors that we send on the road recruiting students. The problem-solution organizational pattern is a pretty straightforward approach to presenting a solution to something by explaining first the problem that you're trying to solve and then the thing that is going to solve it the best. This is very good for reports where you're justifying something. Let's say, for example, again, I'm choosing issues that I've dealt with. This is something that we, by law, are required to deal with on college campuses. How are we going to prevent illegal software downloads? How are we going to prevent students from downloading copyrighted things? And we had to, first of all, describe the problem to our board and to our cabinet, and then we had to come up with a plan to install monitoring software to prevent copyrighted materials from being downloaded. This is a pretty straightforward way to organize something, but it's a very effective way when you are justifying an action or arguing for an action, because very often people will not understand the problem you're trying to solve until you explain the problem. So a good part of solving problems is explaining those problems to people who control resources and then presenting the solution after they understand the full nature of the problem. The elimination of alternatives organizational pattern is similar to the problem and solution pattern, except that here you describe a problem and then you describe a number of solutions and you eliminate the solutions that are completely impossible. The best time to use one of these kinds of strategies is when you know you're going to have to do something that isn't going to be popular and isn't going to be approved of, but it's the only thing to do. You have to do something. Doing nothing has become untenable, so you have to convince people to do something that's going to be unpopular, and the only way to do that is to show them that even though this is not an ideal solution, it is the best practical solution. Here's an example. Again, this is not one that I've dealt with, but it's one that I've seen municipalities deal with. What's the best kind of power plant to build? And let's say we're going to decide that the best kind of power plant to build is a nuclear power plant. Well, that's going to set off all kinds of bells. We don't want to have a nuclear power plant. Don't you see what happened in Japan? Stuff will blow up. People will glow in the dark. There are a lot of downsides to nuclear power. So if that's the solution that you've chosen or that you're going to advocate, what you have to do is begin with all of the other alternatives and explain why they're not feasible. Not building a power plant is not a feasible option because our population does not have enough power to meet its needs. Coal is messy and it pollutes the air and it has immediate health impacts. Water power is wonderful if you live by a river, but we don't. Wind power is extremely expensive to create the wind generators, we'll say, and it will only yield 20% of the power that we need even after all of that expense. Once we eliminate all of those, then the somewhat less palatable option stands clear as the only thing that we can do. So by eliminating alternatives, you build to a best possible, not an ideal solution to a problem. The next pattern is actually two patterns that are the inverse of each other. The general to particular pattern, or the deductive pattern of presentation, or the particular to general pattern, or the inductive pattern of generalization. These are two ways to deal with specific issues that are tied to bigger, kind of more global pictures. And they're very good organizational patterns for some things. So the general to particular pattern starts with the big picture and then moves to something specific. So we will begin, say, discussing currency fluctuation in Asian markets and what Japan and India are doing and how these currency fluctuations are destabilizing the money supply in less affluent Asian nations. And we'll talk about the global issues and why they're important. And then we will move to our very specific issue, which is the shoes that we make require that we buy material from Indonesia. And what are these currency fluctuations going to do to our cash flow situation, because we're never going to know quite how much those shoes are going to cost us given the currency fluctuations. So we've got a plan for that. The specific to general just moves exactly in the reverse. You start with a specific issue and then you move to the big picture and talk about how you're going to respond to the big picture. Gas prices are really high and that's a problem. Well, why are gas prices high? Well, they're high, lots of reasons. But let's talk about, for the last 10 years, what the car buying trends have been. People have been, say, buying less fuel-efficient cars because they have other kinds of values to them. And if we want to position ourselves in our car market, given where gas prices are going, we're going to have to try to be a very energy-efficient alternative, and that's going to play into where car buying trends are going in the next 5 years, and we want to make sure that we're ahead of that curve. So the deductive and the inductive patterns of organizations are simply ways to relate what's going on with big pictures. Sometimes space gives you the organizational pattern that you need for your report or the paper that you're writing. You can organize by the shape of something or the geography of something. This works especially when you're looking at localities, communities, states, nations. Let's say that I belong to a large credit company and I want to trace the consumer demand for credit and how it's decreased. And to do that, I'm going to look at 6 different regions of the country that represent our 6 different major service areas. Then the report has basically organized itself. I just do a little subheading and use each of the 6 areas and describe each of the trends in those 6 areas, and then I put it all together into an overall set of recommendations for the report. Another common way to organize is by function. Let's say that I work for a computer company and I'm giving a report to the board, and the board is made up of bankers and business people who don't really understand much about the computer industry. So in order to describe what we're doing this quarter, I need to describe our business by functions. So hardware is a function. Software is a function, or within a category like software, there are entertainment programs, there are networking programs, there are word processing programs, database programs. So you can describe what you're doing by the function that they have. It's also a good way to describe a team of people. If you have a team of 10 people, you can describe each one and what they do, and that becomes the organizational pattern for the report that you're writing. It's describing the pieces of what you're describing by how they function, what they do, what role they serve in something bigger. And finally, a lot of reports about what has happened, or even about what may happen in the future, work best if they're organized chronologically, by timelines. If I wanted to talk about how Barack Obama won the presidential election in 2008, I might just organize my report by January, February, March, April, etc. If I wanted to talk about what we're going to do in the future, say we have, as we do at Newman University, a strategic plan. We have a timeline of what we're going to do for the next 5 years, and we have that broken down into every semester. And that becomes the report. So the chronological organization just takes advantage, and all of these do this. They take advantage of the nature of what you're reporting to break it down into manageable pieces so that you can have a coherent way to describe what comes first and what comes next, rather than just putting it up randomly and haphazardly. There are other kinds of organizational patterns that you may consider. These are among the most important or the most used, but look at your information, look at how it naturally breaks down, and then be very intentional about organizing your report around the way that your information makes sense.